The world was changing rapidly, and the great centers of power were playing new games for their own interests. A race was underway to seize control of weaker nations' resources. In these circumstances, a young president from Burkina Faso emerged, Ibrahim Traoré. He was a leader who didn't just show his people dreams, but actively fought for their rights. His courage and honesty made him a revolutionary and fearless leader throughout Africa. The morning sun cast long shadows across the presidential palace in Ouagadougou as Ibrahim Traoré reviewed the stack of documents on his desk. Each page told a story of exploitation, of resources extracted from African soil to enrich distant shareholders, of promises broken and people forgotten. His jaw tightened as he read the latest reports from mining operations in the eastern provinces. Another foreign company had been caught operating without proper permits, their profits flowing to offshore accounts while local communities remained in poverty. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His chief of staff entered, carrying a cream-colored envelope bearing the official seal of the United Nations. "Mr. President," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of concern, "this arrived through diplomatic channels this morning." Ibrahim examined the envelope carefully before opening it. Inside was an elegantly embossed invitation to a special UN conference in the United States. The theme was printed in gold letters: eradication of poverty, resource distribution, and global peace. On the surface, it appeared to be a constructive meeting, the kind of international gathering where world leaders discussed noble ideals and made grand proclamations. But Ibrahim's experienced eyes detected something else. The timing was suspicious, coming just weeks after his government had announced plans to renegotiate mining contracts with Western companies. The guest list, though selective, included several officials known for their ties to multinational corporations. Most telling was the venue. Not the usual UN headquarters in New York, but a private conference center in Washington, D.C., away from the scrutiny of international media and civil society organizations. "They want me isolated," Ibrahim thought, reading between the lines of diplomatic courtesy. "They want me in their territory, on their terms." His advisors gathered that afternoon to discuss the invitation. The room buzzed with tension as senior ministers, military officials, and trusted confidants debated the merits and risks of accepting. General Ouedraogo, a veteran soldier with scars from decades of conflict, was the first to voice his concerns. "Mr. President, this has all the hallmarks of a trap. They've been pressuring us economically for months. Now they want to isolate you politically." Minister of Foreign Affairs Fatimata Kabore nodded in agreement. "Our intelligence suggests that several Western agencies have been monitoring our activities closely. They're particularly concerned about our new partnerships with China and Russia for infrastructure development." Ibrahim listened carefully to each perspective, his fingers drumming silently on the polished conference table. The room fell silent as he stood and walked to the large map of Africa hanging on the wall. His eyes traced the borders of Burkina Faso, then expanded to encompass the entire continent, a landmass rich in gold, uranium, diamonds, oil, and rare earth minerals, yet home to some of the world's poorest populations. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said finally, turning back to face the room, "they invite me not because they respect our sovereignty, but because they fear it. For too long, African leaders have been summoned to Western capitals like children called to the principal's office. We go, we listen, we nod, and we return with empty promises while our resources continue to flow northward." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "But what if this time is different? What if, instead of being lectured about democracy and good governance while our gold fills their vaults, we turn the tables? What if we go not as supplicants, but as equals demanding accountability?" The room erupted in murmurs of both admiration and concern. Defense Minister Borema Kante leaned forward in his chair. "Mr. President, with respect, they won't simply listen to uncomfortable truths. They have ways of silencing voices that threaten their interests." Ibrahim's expression grew solemn. He thought of Thomas Sankara, his predecessor and hero, who had spoken similar truths and paid the ultimate price. He thought of Patrice Lumumba in Congo, of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, of all the African leaders who had dared to challenge the global order and found themselves isolated, overthrown, or worse. "Perhaps," he said quietly, But silence in the face of injustice is complicity. They expect me to decline this invitation, to hide behind our borders while they continue their games. But what message does that send to our people? What example does that set for future generations of African leaders? The debate continued for hours. Some argued for diplomatic caution, others for complete rejection of the invitation. But Ibrahim had already made his decision. He would go to Washington, not as a victim seeking mercy, but as a truth-teller demanding justice. He would carry with him evidence of decades of exploitation, documentation of resource theft, and proof of the economic warfare waged against African nations. That evening, as the last advisors filed out of the conference room, Ibrahim sat alone with his thoughts. Through the window, he could see the lights of Ouagadougou flickering in the distance, his people going about their evening routines, unaware that their president was about to embark on one of the most dangerous missions of his political career. He opened his secure laptop and began composing his acceptance letter. Each word was carefully chosen, each phrase diplomatically correct, yet subtly defiant. He would attend their conference, but on his own terms. He would speak their language of international law and human rights, but use it to expose their own violations. Most importantly, he would not go alone. The truth would be his companion, documented and undeniable. When Ibrahim set off for his journey, he refused to accept any royal protocol. He sat with ordinary passengers on the plane, wearing simple clothes, carrying a book in his hand, and displaying tranquil confidence on his face. He knew this journey wasn't merely about political speeches, but the beginning of a new struggle and effort. The Air Burkina flight to Paris was far from luxurious. Ibrahim had deliberately chosen a commercial flight over the private jet that had been offered by the conference organizers. He sat in economy class, much to the bewilderment of the cabin crew who had expected to serve a head of state in first class. His security detail, reduced to a bare minimum at his insistence, occupied nearby seats while trying to blend in with regular passengers. Beside him sat Ibrahim Traoré, a young journalist from Ouagadougou who had been documenting the president's reforms. She was making her first international trip, her notebook already filled with observations about the journey. Across the aisle, Dr. Sidou Koulibaly, the president's economic advisor, reviewed financial documents that would become crucial evidence in the days ahead. "Mr. President," Aminata whispered, "aren't you concerned about traveling so openly?" Ibrahim smiled, closing the book he had been reading, a worn copy of Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. "Aminata, if we hide behind bulletproof glass and armored cars, how can we claim to represent the common man? My legitimacy comes not from protocol, but from the people who elected me. They travel this way, so I travel this way." The flight attendant, a middle-aged woman from Senegal, recognized him during the meal service. Her eyes widened, and she quickly called over her colleagues. Soon, word had spread throughout the cabin, and passengers were stealing glances at the president who sat among them like an ordinary traveler. An elderly man from Ghana, returning from visiting his grandchildren in Burkina Faso, approached Ibrahim during the flight. "Mr. President," he said in accented English, "my grandson tells me you're fighting for our resources to stay in Africa. Is this true?" Ibrahim nodded, gesturing for the man to sit in the empty seat beside him. "Uncle, for too long our gold has made others rich while our children lack proper schools. Our uranium powers cities in Europe while our villages have no electricity. We're not fighting against the world, we're fighting for justice." The old man's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "In my lifetime, I have seen many leaders make such promises. Most forget them once they taste power." "Then help me remember," Ibrahim replied, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "When I return, remind me of this conversation. Hold me accountable to these words." During the layover in Paris, Ibrahim faced his first taste of what awaited him in America. French intelligence officers, dressed as airport security, conducted an unusually thorough random security check. His briefcase was examined with particular attention. Every document photographed under the guise of standard procedure. "Interesting reading material," one officer commented, noting the files on mining contracts and resource extraction data. "Public information," Ibrahim replied calmly. Perhaps your government would be interested in reviewing how French companies acquired their mining licenses in Burkina Faso during the colonial period. The officer's expression tightened, but he said nothing more. The message had been delivered on both sides. Ibrahim knew he was being monitored, and the intelligence services knew he was aware of their surveillance. The final leg of the journey took them across the Atlantic Ocean. As the plane flew through the night, Ibrahim gazed out at the vast darkness below, broken occasionally by the lights of ships crossing the ocean. These same waters had carried millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas centuries ago. Now they carried an African president on a mission to reclaim his continent's dignity. Dr. Coulibaly moved to the seat beside him as most passengers slept. "Mr. President, I've been thinking about our strategy. If they try to isolate us in these meetings—" "They will," Ibrahim interrupted. "But isolation can work both ways. When they try to corner us, we'll force them to reveal their true intentions. Every accusation they make will be an opportunity to present our evidence. And if they try to prevent us from speaking altogether," Ibrahim's expression grew serious, "then we'll have our answer about the true nature of their democratic values and free speech. Sometimes silence is more eloquent than words." As dawn broke over the eastern coast of the United States, Ibrahim prepared for what might be the most important battle of his political career. Looking down at the approaching American coastline, he thought of the paradox below, a nation built on ideals of freedom and democracy, yet one whose prosperity had often depended on the exploitation of others. The plane began its descent into John F. Kennedy International Airport. Ibrahim could see the Manhattan skyline in the distance, those towering symbols of American power and wealth. He thought about the resources that had built those skyscrapers: gold from Ghana, diamonds from Congo, oil from Nigeria, and yes, uranium from Burkina Faso. Today, he whispered to himself, the colonized will speak to the colonizers. Today, the exploited will confront the exploiters. And today, truth will have its day in court. Looking out of the airplane window at the clouds, he said to himself, "Power is not in guns or wealth, but in truth. And I'm carrying that truth which the world has suppressed for years." Upon arriving in America, media cameras swarmed him. There were flashlights everywhere and the echo of questions. A reporter asked, "President Traoré, do you think Africa can ever be free from the pressure of great powers?" A slight smile appeared on Ibrahim's lips. He calmly said, "Freedom is not someone's gift. It is our right." This became a statement that instantly made headlines around the world. The American agencies, already cautious, became even more alert. They realized this African leader was not an ordinary politician, but a storm. The chaos at JFK International Airport was unprecedented for a visiting African head of state. Usually, such arrivals were managed quietly, with minimal media attention and carefully choreographed photo opportunities. But Ibrahim Traoré's presence had generated unusual interest. News of his recent speeches about economic sovereignty had spread beyond Africa, attracting attention from international media outlets hungry for a story that challenged the established narrative about African leadership. As Ibrahim emerged from the customs area, the wall of camera flashes was blinding. Microphones thrust forward from every direction, held by journalists shouting questions in multiple languages. The airport security seemed overwhelmed by the crowd, their initial preparation clearly insufficient for this level of media attention. "President Traoré! President Traoré!" voices called out. American networks, European correspondents, and African diaspora media all competed for his attention. His small security detail worked to create a path through the crowd while maintaining the low-profile approach Ibrahim had insisted upon. A blonde reporter from CNN pushed forward, her cameraman struggling to keep up. "Mr. President, critics say your recent statements about Western companies in Africa are inflammatory. How do you respond?" Ibrahim paused, considering his words carefully. He could have deflected, could have given a diplomatic non-answer that would satisfy no one but offend no one. Instead, he chose directness. "I respond with facts," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the airport noise. When a company extracts $1 billion worth of gold from African soil and leaves behind only holes in the ground and poverty in the communities, That is not business. That is theft. The crowd of journalists pressed closer, sensing they were witnessing something unusual, an African leader speaking, without the careful diplomatic language typically expected at such events. Reporter from the Financial Times called out, "Mr. President, don't you think such statements might damage investment confidence in your country?" Ibrahim's smile was patient but pointed. Investment means both parties benefit. What you call investment confidence often means our confidence that we will be exploited. Perhaps it's time to reconsider what real investment looks like. Behind the media scrum, 3 men in dark suits watched intently. They wore no identification badges, carried no recording equipment, but their practiced observation skills and coordinated movements marked them as intelligence operatives. One spoke quietly into a small microphone hidden in his sleeve. Subject is more articulate than expected. Media engagement is not following predicted patterns. Recommend elevated monitoring protocols. The response crackled through his earpiece. Confirmed. All units maintain visual contact. Documentation of all statements required for assessment. As Ibrahim's small entourage made their way toward the airport exit, the questions continued to fly. A young journalist from African Arguments magazine managed to get close enough for a more substantive question. "Mr. President, what specific changes do you hope to achieve through this conference?" Ibrahim stopped walking, causing his security detail to tense momentarily. He turned to face the young man, recognizing in him the earnest hope that had driven his own entry into politics years earlier. "Young man, I hope to achieve something very simple and very revolutionary. I hope to tell the truth. For decades, these conferences have been exercises in maintaining the status quo while using the language of change. African leaders are invited to listen to lectures about governance while the lecturers' companies strip our continents bare." His voice grew stronger as he continued, drawing the attention of every microphone in range. "I hope to reverse that dynamic. Instead of defending Africa's right to exist, I intend to question why certain Western policies exist. Instead of justifying our sovereignty, I will demand justification for actions that violate it." The intelligence operatives exchanged glances. This was definitely not the carefully managed media interaction they had expected. Their subject was off script, speaking with a passion and directness that could prove problematic. For the carefully orchestrated narrative they had hoped to maintain, the ride from JFK to Manhattan provided Ibrahim with his first close look at American urban landscape. The highway system impressed him. Its scale and efficiency were undeniable. But as an economist, he also understood the hidden costs, the displacement of communities to build these roads, the environmental impact, the debt structures that made such projects possible. "Dr. Coulibaly," he said to his economic advisor, who sat beside him in the black sedan provided by the conference organizers, "look at this infrastructure. Impressive, yes? But remember, much of it was built using profits extracted from precisely the kinds of resource extraction agreements we're challenging." Through the bulletproof windows, they could see the Manhattan skyline growing larger. Those towers represented the pinnacle of global capitalism, the nerve centers where decisions were made that affected billions of people worldwide. Yet how many people knew that some of those same buildings had been constructed using materials sourced through exploitative contracts with African nations? The intelligence vehicles followed at discreet distances, their occupants maintaining constant surveillance. Phone calls were made, reports were filed, and somewhere in Washington, D.C., senior officials were beginning to understand that Ibrahim Traoré represented a different kind of challenge than they had anticipated. As they crossed into Manhattan, Ibrahim's phone buzzed with messages from around the world. News of his airport statements was already spreading on social media. African diaspora communities were sharing clips of his remarks. Academic circles were debating his assertions. Most importantly, journalists were beginning to ask the kinds of questions that made certain corporations and government agencies very uncomfortable. The hotel where the delegation would stay was a stark symbol of the contradictions Ibrahim had come to address. The Mandarin Oriental was luxury incarnate, its rooms costing more per night than most Burkinabe earned in a month. Yet Ibrahim's presence there was not about personal comfort. It was about occupying spaces of power, and using them to project a different kind of message. That evening, as Ibrahim looked out from his hotel window at the glittering lights of New York City, he reflected on the day's events. The media reaction had been more intense than expected, but the message had been delivered clearly. Tomorrow would bring the real test, face-to-face confrontation with those who preferred their African counterparts to be grateful and compliant. His phone rang. The caller ID showed it was President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana. "Ibrahim," came the familiar voice. "I've been watching the news. You're making waves before the conference even begins." "Nana," Ibrahim replied, "waves are what happen when something new enters calm waters. Perhaps these waters have been calm for too long. Be careful, my friend. They don't appreciate leaders who can't be managed." Ibrahim looked out at the city lights, each one representing lives, dreams, and struggles. Then perhaps it's time they learn to appreciate leaders who represent their people's interests rather than foreign boardrooms' profits. As he ended the call, Ibrahim understood that there was no turning back. The gauntlet had been thrown down, the challenge issued. Tomorrow would determine whether truth could indeed stand against power, or whether power would once again find ways to silence uncomfortable realities. During the journey from the airport to the hotel, Secret Service cars were trailing him. The traffic was flowing normally on the road, but he felt that every moment some eye was watching him. His African companions whispered, "Mr. President, these people don't trust you. Every step they take is suspicious." Ibrahim gently looked out the window. New York's towering buildings were glittering in the darkness of night. He began thinking that within these very walls decisions are made that have been affecting the fate of weak nations for centuries. But today, he was present in this city with his own identity, an identity that powerful lobbies couldn't tolerate. The first concrete warning came in an unexpected form. As Ibrahim's motorcade wound through Manhattan traffic, his security chief noticed something that made him reach for his radio. The three black SUVs that had been maintaining a discreet following distance since JFK had been joined by two additional vehicles. More concerning was the fact that they were no longer maintaining the professional distance typical of official security protocols. "Mr. President," Security Chief Captain Sankara spoke quietly from the front passenger seat. "We have company. More company than diplomatic protocol would typically require." Ibrahim followed his security chief's gaze to the side mirrors. The vehicles were there, clearly visible now that attention had been drawn to them. Their windows were tinted beyond legal limits, and their license plates bore the distinctive markers of government vehicles, but not the specific diplomatic plates that would indicate official escort duties. Dr. Coulibaly leaned forward from the back seat. "Should we be concerned?" Before Ibrahim could answer, his encrypted phone vibrated with an incoming message from an unknown number. The text was brief but chilling. "Your hotel room is monitored. Your phones are tapped. They know about the documents. Trust no one here. A friend." Ibrahim showed the message to his companions without speaking, then deleted it immediately. The car fell silent except for the hum of traffic around them. Each man understood that their mission had entered a new phase, one where their safety could no longer be guaranteed. As they pulled up to the Mandarin Oriental, the escort vehicles took up positions around the hotel perimeter. It was far more security than any visiting African head of state typically received, and everyone in the car understood that this was not protection, it was containment. The hotel lobby was a study in elegant oppression. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over marble floors, but Ibrahim noticed the unusual number of well-dressed individuals who seemed to be waiting for nothing in particular. Their positions gave them clear sightlines to the elevators and exits. Their casual conversations ended abruptly when the African delegation entered. At the reception desk, the process of checking in took far longer than necessary. Additional paperwork appeared, extra signatures were required, and a series of routine security questions delayed their progress by nearly an hour. Meanwhile, those waiting individuals maintained their positions, occasionally speaking into concealed microphones. "Welcome to the United States. Mr. President," said the hotel manager, a nervous man whose smile never reached his eyes. We've upgraded your suite to the penthouse level for your security and privacy. Ibrahim understood immediately. The penthouse level would be easier to monitor, more isolated from potential supporters or journalists, and more difficult to leave discreetly if necessary. "Thank you," he replied smoothly. "But I prefer to stay with my originally booked accommodation. The standard diplomatic suite will be perfectly adequate." The manager's composure cracked slightly. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, sir. Security protocols require—" "Whose security protocols?" Ibrahim interrupted gently but firmly. "I was not aware that visiting heads of state surrendered their accommodation preferences to foreign hotel managers." The standoff lasted only moments, but everyone present understood its significance. After a hurried consultation with persons unseen, the manager relented. "Of course, Mr. President. Your original accommodation will be prepared immediately." In the elevator, surrounded by mirrors that reflected their images infinitely, the delegation remained silent. Each man was processing the same realization. They were no longer guests in a foreign country, but players in a game where the rules were being rewritten in real time. The corridor leading to their rooms was unusually busy for early evening. Housekeeping staff moved with purposes that didn't seem to involve cleaning. Maintenance workers examined fixtures that appeared to be functioning perfectly. A florist arranged flowers that would have been more appropriate for a funeral than a diplomatic visit. Inside his suite, Ibrahim conducted a thorough but casual inspection while maintaining normal conversation with his advisors. The room was luxurious beyond anything available in Ouagadougou, but luxury was not his concern. Behind paintings, he found small devices that could have been smoke detectors but weren't positioned appropriately for fire safety. The telephone had additional components that served no obvious function. Even the electrical outlet seemed to have been recently modified. "Gentlemen," he said in French, gambling that any listening devices would be programmed primarily for English and major local languages, "tomorrow we will present our case to people who have already made up their minds about us. Tonight, we should prepare for that reality." Dr. Coulibaly nodded, understanding both the literal meaning and the implied message. They were being monitored, but they were not helpless. "Mr. President, the economic data we've compiled should speak for itself, regardless of the audience's preconceptions." "Indeed," Ibrahim replied, moving to the window and looking out at the city lights. "Truth has a way of being heard, even when some people prefer not to listen." That night, as his companions settled into their rooms, Ibrahim remained awake, standing by the window and thinking about the path that had brought him to this moment. He thought about Thomas Sankara, his political hero and predecessor, who had faced similar pressures and paid the ultimate price for his unwillingness to compromise on principles. He thought about the children in Burkinabe, schools who studied by candlelight while electricity generated by Burkinabe uranium powered cities thousands of miles away. He thought about the farmers whose land had been seized for foreign mining operations, and about the young people who risked their lives crossing the Sahara Desert because they saw no future in their resource-rich homeland. These thoughts strengthened his resolve. Whatever dangers tomorrow might bring, whatever pressures might be applied, he would not betray the trust of those who had sent him here. He would speak their truth to power, regardless of the consequences. Around 2 a.m., there was a soft knock at his door. When he opened it, he found a young woman in hotel uniform, but something about her movements suggested military training rather than hospitality service. "Mr. President," she whispered urgently, "I bring a message from friends. Tomorrow's meeting is not what it appears to be. They plan to make accusations against you, to isolate you diplomatically, but you have support, people who believe in your mission. Be ready for anything." Before he could respond, she was gone, disappearing down the corridor with professional efficiency. Ibrahim closed the door and stood in the darkness, understanding that the real battle was about to begin. The question was no longer whether he would be challenged, but whether truth and justice could prevail when confronted by the full weight of entrenched power. The clock on the nightstand ticked toward dawn, each second bringing him closer to a confrontation that would define not only his presidency, but possibly the future of Africa's relationship with the global economic system. As the first light of dawn appeared on the horizon, Ibrahim made his final preparations for a day that would test everything he believed about justice, courage, and the power of truth. The next day after arriving in America, Ibrahim Traoré received an unexpected message. A white envelope had been slipped under his hotel room door. Opening the envelope revealed a formal invitation bearing the letterhead of the U.S. Department of the Interior. The letter read, "We are including you in a special meeting in Washington on the subject of international cooperation and security. Your presence would be an honor for us." The words contained obvious flattery, but Ibrahim's experienced heart immediately sensed danger. This invitation was not merely ceremonial. The thought crossed his mind. This meeting might be a move against me. The morning brought an acceleration of events that confirmed Ibrahim's worst suspicions. The invitation had arrived through unofficial channels, which was unusual for a legitimate diplomatic engagement. More troubling was the proposed venue, not the State Department or any official government building, but a private facility in suburban Virginia identified only as the International Security Cooperation Center. Dr. Coulibaly was the first to voice his concerns as the delegation gathered for breakfast in Ibrahim's suite. "Mr. President, I've never heard of this facility. It doesn't appear in any directory of U.S. government buildings, and our embassy here has no record of previous diplomatic meetings at this location." Captain Sankara, their security chief, spread several photographs across the coffee table. "Sir, I had our contacts conduct reconnaissance of the address provided. The facility is heavily secured, more like a military installation than a conference center. Multiple checkpoints, electronic surveillance, and what appears to be communications jamming equipment." Ibrahim studied the photographs while sipping his coffee. The building was nondescript from the outside. Modern architecture, tinted windows, landscaping that provided clear sight lines, but no cover for approaching vehicles. It looked exactly like the kind of facility where inconvenient people might be taken for conversations they didn't want to have. "They're not even pretending anymore," observed Aminata, the journalist who had accompanied them from Burkina Faso. "This has all the subtlety of a kidnapping invitation." The phone in Ibrahim's suite rang. The hotel operator announced that there was an urgent call from the conference organizers. When Ibrahim accepted the call, the voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and completely without warmth. "Mr. President, this is Director Hamilton from the Conference Coordination Office. We need to confirm your attendance at tomorrow's special session. Transportation will be provided, and for security reasons, we'll need to limit your delegation to essential personnel only." "Define essential personnel," Ibrahim replied. "Yourself and perhaps one advisor. Security concerns require us to minimize the number of participants." Ibrahim understood immediately. They wanted to isolate him, separate him from his support structure, and create a situation where he would be outnumbered and potentially vulnerable. "Director Hamilton, I wasn't aware that the United States had become so dangerous that visiting heads of state required such extreme security measures." There was a pause on the line. "Mr. President, these are standard protocols for sensitive discussions involving national security matters." National security? I was under the impression this was a conference about poverty eradication and resource distribution. Has that agenda changed? Another pause, longer this time. "The agenda has been refined based on recent developments. Your recent statements have raised certain concerns that require clarification." After ending the call, Ibrahim turned to his advisors. "Gentlemen, we've just been told that speaking about African sovereignty is now a national security issue for the United States. I think we can safely assume that tomorrow's meeting is not about cooperation. The rest of the day was spent in careful preparation." Dr. Coulibaly organized the documentary. Evidence they had brought: mining, contracts that violated international law, bank records showing resource revenues flowing to offshore accounts, correspondence between government officials and corporate executives discussing population management in mining areas. Meanwhile, Captain Sankara established communication protocols with supporters in various African capitals, ensuring that if the delegation faced detention or worse, the international community would be alerted immediately. He also identified alternate routes from the hotel and verified the locations of friendly embassies in the Washington area. That evening, a different kind of visitor arrived. Dr. James Morrison, identified as a private consultant but clearly representing someone with significant resources, requested a meeting. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 60s, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Mr. President," he began after being admitted to the suite, "I represent certain interests that are concerned about tomorrow's meeting. We believe there may be misunderstandings that could be clarified before any regrettable statements are made." Ibrahim gestured for him to sit. "Dr. Morrison, what kind of misunderstandings?" "Well, sir, there seems to be some confusion about the nature of business relationships between American companies and African governments. Some of your recent statements suggest that you view these relationships as exploitative, when in fact they represent mutually beneficial partnerships." "Mutually beneficial," Ibrahim repeated slowly. "Dr. Morrison, when an American company extracts $1 billion worth of gold from Burkinabe soil and pays the government $50 million in fees, who benefits more from this partnership?" Morrison's smile became strained. "Mr. President, you're oversimplifying complex economic relationships. These companies provide employment, technology transfer, and infrastructure development. They provide employment that pays local workers less in a month than American workers earn in a day. They provide technology that extracts our resources more efficiently for their benefit. And they provide infrastructure, roads, and railways that transport our wealth to their ports." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Morrison becoming increasingly direct about the consequences of misrepresenting American business interests. His final statement was barely concealed threat. "Mr. President, tomorrow's meeting will give you an opportunity to clarify your position. I hope for everyone's sake that you'll choose to be diplomatic." After Morrison left, the suite fell silent. Everyone understood that the pretense of friendly cooperation had been abandoned. Tomorrow's meeting was designed to be a public humiliation, a demonstration that even African presidents who spoke too boldly could be brought to heel. "Mr. President," Dr. Coulibaly said quietly, "we could still decline this meeting. We could cite security concerns and return to Burkina Faso." Ibrahim considered this for a moment. It would be the safe choice, the pragmatic choice. He could return home and continue his reforms within Burkina Faso's borders, avoiding international confrontation. But he thought about the children studying by candlelight, about the farmers whose land had been seized, about the young people dying in the desert because they saw no future at home. "Dr. Coulibaly," he said finally, "if we run from this confrontation, we validate everything they believe about African leadership. They expect us to be intimidated, to back down when pressured. Tomorrow, we're going to show them what happens when African leaders refuse to be intimidated." The night passed slowly, with each member of the delegation lost in his own thoughts about what tomorrow might bring. None of them slept well, but all of them were resolved to face whatever awaited them. They had come too far, and the stakes were too high to retreat now. As dawn broke over Washington, D.C., Ibrahim stood once again at his window, looking out at the city where the most powerful decisions on earth were made. Today, he would enter the heart of that power structure not as a supplicant seeking favor, but as an equal demanding justice. The outcome would determine not just his own fate, but the future of Africa's relationship with the global economy. The morning of the meeting arrived with an ominous stillness. Washington's weather was strange that day. Cold wind was blowing outside, and moisture droplets had settled on the hotel windows. Ibrahim Traoré sat alone in his room, surrounded by stacks of files on his desk and an open briefcase beside him. The room's dim lighting reflected in his eyes, which were focused on the papers, but his mind was wandering elsewhere. The black sedan arrived at precisely 9:30 a.m., as promised. It was not the typical diplomatic vehicle, but something more reminiscent of federal law enforcement: bulletproof glass, enhanced suspension, communications equipment visible through the front windows. 2 additional vehicles flanked it, their occupants wearing the unmistakable bearing of intelligence operatives rather than diplomatic security. Ibrahim had chosen to bring only Dr. Coulibaly with him, as requested. Captain Sankara had argued strenuously against this limitation, but Ibrahim understood the game being played. They wanted to isolate him, to create a scenario where he would be overwhelmed by the number of adversaries in the room. Bringing a large delegation would only provide them with more targets for intimidation. "Mr. President," Dr. Coulibaly said as they settled into the sedan's back seat, "the documents are organized according to chronology and subject matter. The financial records are in the blue folder, the mining contracts in red, and the communications intercepts in green." Ibrahim nodded, his hands resting on the briefcase that contained 5 years of painstaking research and documentation. Every page represented a story of exploitation, every contract a betrayal of African sovereignty, every bank transfer a theft of resources that belonged to African people. The drive through Washington's suburbs took them past the familiar monuments and government buildings of the American capital, but their destination lay in a different direction. The International Security Cooperation Center was located in Virginia, surrounded by forests and farmland that provided natural screening from public view. As they approached the facility, Ibrahim noticed the security measures Captain Sankara had described in his reconnaissance report. Multiple checkpoints slowed their progress, with armed guards examining credentials at each stop. Electronic scanners swept their vehicle, and trained German shepherds circled the car, ostensibly checking for explosives, but clearly demonstrating the level of control being exerted. The building itself was imposing in its sterility, a modernist structure of steel and glass that seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. As their sedan pulled into the circular driveway, Ibrahim could see figures moving behind the tinted windows of the upper floors. They were being watched, evaluated, and probably recorded from multiple angles. "Dr. Coulibaly," Ibrahim said quietly, as they prepared to exit the vehicle, "remember that we are here as equals, not as defendants. Whatever accusations they make, whatever pressure they apply, we respond with facts and dignity." The entrance hall was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, disguised as architectural elegance. Marble floors reflected the harsh overhead lighting, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously grand and sterile. American flags flanked the reception area, but there were no flags representing other nations, a subtle but clear message about hierarchy and power. Security screening was far more intensive than anything Ibrahim had experienced. Even at military installations in West Africa, full-body scanners, metal detectors, explosive residue tests, and a thorough examination of every document in their briefcases. The guards were professional but cold, treating the visiting African president like a potential terrorist rather than a diplomatic guest. "Mr. President," said a woman in a severe business suit who appeared to be the facility's director, "welcome to the International Security Cooperation Center. I'm Director Patricia Kellerman. If you'll follow me, the other participants are waiting." As they walked through corridors lined with portraits of American military and intelligence leaders, Ibrahim noticed that the facility was much larger than it appeared from outside. Multiple wings extended in different directions, and the security presence was constant. Guards at every intersection, cameras in every corner, and the subtle hum of electronic surveillance equipment. The conference room they entered was designed to overwhelm. A massive oval table dominated the space, surrounded by high-backed chairs that could accommodate perhaps 30 people. Crystal chandeliers hung from a vaulted ceiling, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the Virginia countryside. Though Ibrahim suspected, those same windows were designed to prevent anyone inside from being seen from outside already. Seated around the table were representatives from various U.S. agencies, State Department officials, Defense Department liaisons, CIA personnel, though their affiliations were not explicitly stated, and several individuals who were introduced only as private consultants, but who clearly represented corporate interests. At the head of the table sat a man Ibrahim immediately recognized from intelligence briefings, General Marcus Thompson, former head of U.S. Africa Command and now serving as a special advisor on African affairs. His presence confirmed that this meeting was about far more than economic cooperation. "Mr. President Traoré," General Thompson said, standing to offer a handshake that felt more like a challenge than a greeting. "Thank you for accepting our invitation. We have much to discuss." As Ibrahim and Dr. Coulibaly took their assigned seats, notably positioned at the far end of the table, making them appear to be facing a tribunal rather than participating in a collegial discussion. The atmosphere in the room grew noticeably tenser. Every eye was focused on the two Africans, and the silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Director Kellerman activated a large screen at one end of the room. Today's session concerns threats to international stability and the proper role of emerging democracies in the global economic system, she announced. We have specific concerns about recent statements and policies emanating from certain African governments. The screen displayed a series of news clips: Ibrahim's arrival at JFK Airport, his statements about resource extraction, his criticisms of international mining contracts. Each clip was preceded by inflammatory text describing his words as anti-Western rhetoric or destabilizing propaganda. Mr. President, General Thompson continued, your recent statements have created significant concerns among our allies and partners. We're particularly troubled by your characterizations of legitimate business relationships as exploitation, and your suggestions that American companies are engaged in what you've termed resource theft. Ibrahim had expected this approach, the use of loaded language and emotional framing to put him on the defensive. Instead of responding directly to the accusations, he opened his briefcase and calmly removed a blue folder. General Thompson, he said, his voice steady and clear, I appreciate your concerns about my characterizations. Perhaps we should examine the evidence and determine whether my characterizations are accurate. The room's energy shifted immediately. This was not the response they had expected. African leaders were supposed to become defensive when challenged, to apologize for causing offense, to promise to moderate their language. Instead, Ibrahim was proposing to debate facts. He opened the blue folder and removed a document, holding it up for all to see. This is a mining contract signed between Burkina Faso and Goldcorp International in 2018. According to this contract, Goldcorp was granted extraction rights to approximately 40,000 hectares of gold-rich territory in exchange for a one-time payment of $50 million plus annual royalties of 3% of extracted value. Dr. Coulibaly, understanding his cue, activated his laptop and projected additional information onto a secondary screen. Based on geological surveys, this territory contains an estimated $2.5 billion worth of recoverable gold. The contract grants Goldcorp exclusive extraction rights for 25 years, with automatic renewal options. An uncomfortable murmur ran through the room. Several of the private consultants exchanged glances, and General Thompson's jaw tightened visibly. Ibrahim continued, his voice growing stronger. So let us examine this mathematics, General. Goldcorp pays $50 million up front and 3% annual royalties on extracted value. Over the life of this contract, assuming they extract the full estimated value, they will pay approximately $125 million total to Burkina Faso. In exchange, they receive $2.5 billion worth of gold. He paused, letting the numbers sink in before delivering his conclusion. General Thompson, when someone pays $125 million to receive $2.5 billion, what would you call that relationship? In Burkina Faso, we call it theft. What do you call it in America? The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the room understood that Ibrahim had just demolished the narrative of mutually beneficial partnerships with simple mathematics. More dangerously for those present, he had done it with official documents that they could not dispute. But Ibrahim was far from finished. The real confrontation was just beginning. The atmosphere in the room had suddenly become stifling. The crystal lights above seemed to have dimmed, and the mild light coming through the windows seemed subdued. Everyone was waiting for the first blow to be struck. Ibrahim straightened his chair's backrest and focused his eyes on the screen ahead. His heart was calm, but a wave of fear was creeping through the atmosphere. He knew the game was about to begin, and perhaps the next moment would become the most decisive turning point of his life. The silence was suddenly broken by the sound of a chair scraping. A young female officer abruptly stood up from her seat, a gleaming pistol in her hand, which she pointed directly at Ibrahim Traoré without a moment's hesitation. The room froze as if time itself had stopped. All the officers half rose from their chairs, some dropping their papers in panic. Guards' hands moved to their weapons, but no one dared to take the initiative. The female officer's voice echoed through the room, sharp and trembling. "This man is an enemy among us. He has come to harm the American system in the name of Africa. He has come with a secret agenda." These words fell like lightning in the room. All eyes were focused on Ibrahim, some looking at him with sympathy, others with suspicion, and some faces showed open fear. But Ibrahim Traoré remained calmly seated in his chair, showing no panic or confusion on his face, only a slight smile that revealed the depth of his confidence. The moment had arrived that was already etched in his heart. He knew accusations would be made against him, and he also knew the time had come to break those accusations. Colonel Sarah Mitchell had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq before being assigned to the Africa desk at the Pentagon. Her record was exemplary, her loyalty unquestionable, and her dedication to American interests absolute. But, as she stood with her service weapon trained on a visiting head of state, something fundamental was breaking inside her. "Colonel Mitchell," General Thompson's voice cut through the tension, "lower your weapon immediately. This is a diplomatic facility." But Mitchell's hands were shaking now, and her voice cracked as she spoke. "Sir, the intelligence reports are clear. This man represents a direct threat to American strategic interests. His policies in Burkina Faso have already cost American companies over $800 million in projected revenues. His rhetoric is inspiring similar movements across West Africa." Ibrahim slowly raised his right hand, palm facing forward, not in surrender, but in a gesture that somehow commanded attention more effectively than any shout could have. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but carried clearly to every corner of the room. "Colonel Mitchell," he said, "I am curious about something. You say I am a threat to American strategic interests. Can you define what those interests are?" Mitchell blinked, confusion flickering across her face. This was not the response she had expected. Accused men were supposed to deny, to plead, to show fear. They were not supposed to ask for definitions. You're destabilizing established economic relationships," she stammered. "You're encouraging other African leaders to break existing contracts, to nationalize foreign investments." "Colonel," Ibrahim interrupted gently, "those are actions that benefit African people. I asked about American strategic interests. Are you saying that American strategic interests require African poverty?" A murmur ran through the room. Several of the officials exchanged uncomfortable glances. This was supposed to be an intimidation session, not a philosophical debate about the nature of American foreign policy. Dr. Coulibaly, recognizing his moment, activated his laptop again. New information appeared on the secondary screen. A map of West Africa with resource extraction sites marked in red, shipping routes marked in blue, and military installations marked in black. "Perhaps," Dr. Coulibaly said quietly, "we should examine what American strategic interests actually mean in practical terms." The map showed a stark reality. American and European military bases positioned to protect resource extraction routes, ports designed to export raw materials rather than import finished goods, and transportation infrastructure that moved wealth out of Africa rather than developing local economies. General Thompson stood abruptly. "This is inappropriate. Colonel Mitchell, stand down immediately. Mr. President, this meeting is suspended." "No," Ibrahim said, his voice carrying new authority. "Colonel Mitchell asked a question about threats to American interests. She deserves an honest answer." He opened his briefcase again, this time removing a red folder. "Colonel, you mentioned that my policies have cost American companies $800 million in projected revenues. Let me show you what those projected revenues actually represent." The documents he spread across the table were devastating in their simplicity. Internal corporate communications discussing population management strategies for mining areas, environmental impact reports that had been deliberately suppressed, Health studies showing elevated cancer rates near extraction sites. Colonel Mitchell, Ibrahim continued, his voice growing stronger. This document shows that Goldcorp International projected $800 million in profits from Burkinabe Gold over the next 5 years. To achieve those profits, they planned to relocate 50,000 people from their ancestral lands, contaminate 3 major watersheds, and operate without installing the pollution controls they are required to use in America. He held up another document. This health study, conducted by your own Centers for Disease Control but never released publicly, shows that uranium mining operations in Niger have increased childhood leukemia rates by 340% in surrounding communities. The uranium from those mines powers American nuclear reactors. Mitchell's weapon was wavering now, her conviction crumbling as the evidence mounted. Around the table, officials who had entered the room, confident in their moral authority, were beginning to understand that they were not the heroes of this story. Ibrahim stood slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Colonel Mitchell, I am not your enemy. The enemy is a system that requires other people's suffering to maintain your prosperity. I am not threatening American strategic interests. I'm questioning whether those interests, as currently defined, are worthy of a great nation. The room had become completely silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the highway. Every person present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, an African leader who refused to be intimidated, who possessed documentation that could not be disputed, and who was systematically dismantling the justifications for decades of exploitative policy. Dr. Coulibaly activated his laptop once more, and a final image appeared on the screen. A photograph of children in a Burkinabe village, studying by candlelight because their community had no electricity despite sitting atop uranium deposits that powered cities thousands of miles away. Ladies and gentlemen, Ibrahim said, his voice now carrying the moral authority that comes from absolute truth. This is what your strategic interests look like to the rest of the world. Those children have every right to electricity, education, and a future that doesn't require them to risk their lives crossing deserts to reach countries that consider them unwelcome. Colonel Mitchell's weapon finally dropped to her side. Tears were streaming down her face as she realized that everything she had been told about protecting American interests was actually about protecting American profits at the expense of human lives. I didn't know, she whispered. They told us you were a terrorist, that you wanted to destroy America. Colonel, Ibrahim said gently, I want to save America. I want to save America from becoming a nation that can only prosper through other people's suffering. I want to save America from defining its greatness through other people's poverty. General Thompson had heard enough. This meeting was spiraling completely out of control, and every moment that Ibrahim Traoré continued speaking was another moment of devastating testimony that could be recorded, leaked, and used against American interests globally. This meeting is over, he declared, reaching for his phone to call security. Mr. President, you will be escorted back to your hotel immediately. But Ibrahim Traoré was not finished. He had one more card to play, one more revelation that would ensure this confrontation would be remembered long after everyone in this room had returned to their comfortable lives. General Thompson, he said, opening the final folder in his briefcase. Before you end this meeting, perhaps you should know that everything we have discussed today has been transmitted in real time to journalists, human rights organizations, and African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. The color drained from Thompson's face as he realized the implications. This had not been a private intimidation session. It had been a public testimony, broadcast to the world through encrypted channels that the Americans had been unable to detect or jam. You see, General, Ibrahim continued with a slight smile, you taught me something important about American strategic interests today. You taught me that transparency is their greatest enemy. So I have given the world transparency. The room erupted in chaos as officials realized that their carefully orchestrated intimidation session had become a global expose of American resource extraction policies in Africa. Phone calls were being made, damage control protocols were being activated, and careers were being ended in real time. But Ibrahim Traoré remained calm at the center of the storm. Having achieved something no African leader had accomplished in decades, he had forced the most powerful nation on earth to confront the moral implications of its economic policies, and he had done it in front of the entire world. The truth had indeed set him free, and in doing so, it had begun to set Africa free as well. The room, which had been filled with the noise of guns and shouting just moments before, was now immersed in complete silence. The documents, photographs, and recordings scattered on the table had pierced everyone's eyes like daggers. Those officers who had been determined to corner Ibrahim just moments ago could no longer even look at each other. Ibrahim slowly rose from his chair. His stature and bearing put even more pressure on the room. His voice echoed, deep and strong. "You all thought you would bring me under pressure by making accusations against me. But remember, lies have noise, but truth has weight. And today, this weight is bowing all your necks." These words echoed through the room. Many officers who had initially stood with the female officer now sat down with their eyes lowered. One closed his file, another leaned back in his chair and held his head, and some covered their faces with trembling hands, as if they could no longer bear to see these documents. The transformation in the room was extraordinary to witness. Colonel Mitchell, who minutes earlier had been pointing a weapon at Ibrahim, now sat heavily in her chair, her service pistol holstered but forgotten. The tears on her face had dried, replaced by a look of profound disillusionment that comes when someone discovers that everything they believed about their life's work was built on a foundation of lies. General Thompson, a man who had commanded respect in military circles for 3 decades, found himself unable to meet Ibrahim's gaze. The African president's systematic dismantling of American justifications for resource extraction had left him without any defensible position. Every document Ibrahim had presented was authentic, every statistic was verifiable, and every moral argument was unassailable. "Mr. President," said Deputy Director Harrison from the State Department, his voice barely above a whisper, "we acknowledge that these documents are difficult to dispute. You have presented evidence today that challenges our understanding of these relationships." Ibrahim collected the papers from the table, organizing them methodically as he spoke. "Deputy Director Harrison, these are not just documents. These are the cries of human beings. These photographs are not just meetings. They are evidence of your deals. And these recordings are truths that you have suppressed for years. You said I was the enemy? No. I am the mirror showing you your true face." Dr. Coulibaly stood as well, closing his laptop with quiet dignity. The data they had presented was irrefutable. American companies had extracted over $50 billion worth of resources from West Africa over the past decade, while investing less than $2 billion in local infrastructure and development. The mathematics of exploitation were stark and undeniable. Around the table, the assembled officials were experiencing various stages of moral reckoning. Some, like Colonel Mitchell, were confronting the gap between their personal values and the policies they had been asked to implement. Others were calculating the political fallout from having their private strategies exposed to international scrutiny. But Ibrahim was not interested in their personal crises. He had come to deliver a message, and that message was nearly complete. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of moral certainty, "you have spent this morning trying to paint me as a threat to stability. But I want you to consider what real stability looks like. Walk to the window overlooking the Virginia countryside, a landscape of rolling hills and prosperous farmland that stood in stark contrast to the impoverished mining regions his documents had described. Real stability is not maintained through the suppression of inconvenient truths. Real stability comes from justice, from relationships based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation. What you call stability is actually a carefully maintained system of injustice that requires constant military and economic pressure to sustain." Director Kellerman, who had begun this meeting with confidence in her facility's ability to intimidate a troublesome African leader, now found herself questioning the very premises of her career. "Mr. President, what would you have us do? These relationships have existed for decades. Entire industries depend on current arrangements." "Director Kellerman," Ibrahim interrupted, "entire civilizations depended on slavery for centuries. That did not make slavery moral. Duration does not transform theft into legitimate commerce. The comparison to slavery was deliberate and devastating. Every person in the room understood the parallel Ibrahim was drawing. The extraction of African resources under exploitative contracts was simply the latest evolution of systems designed to transfer wealth from Africa to Europe and America. General Thompson, recognizing that the situation had moved far beyond salvage, made one final attempt to regain control. Mr. President, regardless of these complications, you must understand that there will be consequences for today's actions. The United States has significant influence over international financial institutions, trade relationships. General Thompson, Ibrahim replied with a slight smile, are you threatening me? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Everyone in the room understood that threats against a head of state during what was supposed to be a diplomatic meeting would constitute a major international incident, especially when those threats were being broadcast globally through Ibrahim's hidden transmission equipment. Thompson realized his mistake immediately. No, Mr. President. I was simply explaining the complexity of international relationships. The complexity, Ibrahim said, lies in maintaining justifications for unjustifiable actions. The solution is actually quite simple. Treat African nations as equals, pay fair prices for resources, and invest in local development rather than extraction infrastructure. He returned to the table and closed his briefcase with quiet finality. General Thompson, you have given me something valuable today. You have demonstrated to the world that American power, when challenged with truth and evidence, resorts to threats and intimidation. This demonstration will be more useful to African unity than any speech I could have given at the United Nations. The room's atmosphere had shifted completely from its oppressive beginning. The officials who had entered confident in their ability to manage an uppity African leader were now dealing with the reality that they had been outmaneuvered by someone they had underestimated. As Ibrahim prepared to leave, Colonel Mitchell approached him hesitantly. "Mr. President," she said, her voice still shaky from emotional exhaustion, "I want to apologize. I believed what I was told about you, about the threat you represented. I realize now that the real threat was to a system that I never questioned." Ibrahim studied her face, young, earnest, and now genuinely repentant. "Colonel Mitchell, your apology is accepted. But more importantly, your awakening gives me hope. If one person in this room can see the truth clearly, perhaps others can as well. Perhaps even your country can learn to see clearly." He shook her hand, a gesture that surprised everyone in the room. This was not the behavior of a man who harbored hatred for America or Americans. This was the behavior of someone who distinguished between people and the systems they served. As Ibrahim and Dr. Coulibaly walked toward the door, their footsteps echoing in the now quiet room, every person present understood that they had witnessed something historic. An African leader had entered the heart of American power, refused to be intimidated, presented irrefutable evidence of systematic exploitation, and emerged morally victorious. The door closed behind them with quiet finality, leaving the assembled American officials to contemplate the wreckage of their assumptions and the implications of what had just occurred. Outside the International Security Cooperation Center, the Virginia afternoon air felt different to Ibrahim, cleaner somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted not just from his shoulders, but from the very atmosphere around the building. The same black sedan waited in the circular driveway, but the oppressive security presence that had marked their arrival seemed subdued, almost embarrassed. As they drove back toward Washington, D.C., Dr. Coulibaly was the first to break the silence. "Mr. President, I believe we have accomplished something unprecedented today, but I fear the consequences may be severe." Ibrahim gazed out at the American countryside rolling past their window. Prosperous farms, well-maintained roads, comfortable suburban communities that represented the benefits of global economic dominance. "Dr. Coulibaly, there are always consequences for speaking truth to power. The question is whether those consequences are worse than the ongoing consequences of silence." His encrypted phone began buzzing with incoming messages. The first was from President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana. Ibrahim, the recording is spreading across social media. African Union emergency session called for tomorrow. You've started something that cannot be stopped. More messages followed in rapid succession. Presidents from Mali, Niger, Chad, and Senegal were requesting immediate consultations. The African Development Bank was calling an emergency board meeting. Most significantly, the European Union had announced that it was reviewing its resource extraction partnerships in West Africa, pending clarification of recent allegations. The world is watching now, Ibrahim said, scrolling through the messages. They can no longer conduct these relationships in darkness. But the American response was already beginning to materialize. Dr. Coulibaly's laptop was receiving intelligence briefings from their contacts in various African capitals. The State Department had issued a statement describing the day's events as a misunderstanding that would be clarified through appropriate diplomatic channels. The Defense Department was reportedly conducting an internal review of the Bo facility where the meeting had taken place. More ominously, sources within the International Monetary Fund were suggesting that Burkina Faso's loan applications might face additional scrutiny due to concerns about economic policy consistency. The World Bank had announced that it was reassessing infrastructure projects in countries that had recently adopted confrontational approaches to international partnerships. They're beginning the punishment phase, Dr. Coulibaly observed. Economic warfare through international financial institutions? Ibrahim nodded grimly. He had expected this response. It was the standard American playbook when developing nations stepped out of line. Economic pressure applied through institutions that claimed to be independent but were dominated by Western interests. It was a more sophisticated form of colonialism, but colonialism nonetheless. As they re-entered Washington, D.C., Ibrahim noticed that their security escort had grown larger. Additional vehicles had joined their convoy, and the route they were taking to the hotel was different from their morning journey, longer, more circuitous, passing through areas with less foot traffic and fewer potential observers. Dr. Coulibaly, Ibrahim said quietly, I want you to activate our emergency communication protocols. If we are detained, or if contact is lost, our documentation should be released immediately to all major news organizations and African Union member states. At the Mandarin Oriental, the atmosphere was noticeably different from their departure that morning. Hotel staff were more deferential, almost nervous. The lobby contained several new faces, individuals who clearly weren't guests, but were trying to appear as such. The elevator ride to their floor was conducted in complete silence, with the operator avoiding eye contact. In his suite, Ibrahim found that his belongings had been searched, professionally and carefully, but searched nonetheless. Nothing was missing, but items had been moved slightly from their original positions. His laptop showed signs of having been accessed, though the encrypted files remained secure. A knock at the door interrupted his inspection. Hotel security announced that there was a visitor, Director Patricia Kellerman, from the facility they had visited that morning. She was alone, which was unusual for someone in her position. Mr. President, she said when admitted to the suite, I've come to speak with you privately. Her demeanor was completely different from the morning's confrontation. The aggressive confidence had been replaced by something that looked almost like respect, mixed with professional concern. Director Kellerman, Ibrahim replied, gesturing for her to sit. I assume this is not an official visit. No, sir. I'm here because what happened today has forced me to reconsider some fundamental assumptions about my work. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Mr. President, I've spent 15 years in intelligence and security work. I've always believed we were protecting American interests and promoting global stability. Ibrahim waited, sensing that she was struggling with something significant. But your presentation today, she continued, the documents you showed us, I've spent the evening verifying your evidence. Everything you presented is accurate. The profit ratios, the environmental damage, the health impacts. All of it is documented in classified reports that I have access to, but that are never released publicly. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. Mr. President, there are people in my government who want to escalate this situation. They view your actions today as a direct challenge that requires a strong response. But there are also people who believe you've exposed problems that need to be addressed. Ibrahim considered this carefully. Director Kellerman's visit represented either a genuine attempt at dialogue or a sophisticated intelligence operation designed to gather information about his intentions and capabilities. Director Kellerman, he said finally, what kind of strong response are these people considering? Her expression grew grave. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, possibly encouraging your political opponents. The usual tools. But, Mr. President, some of us believe that approach would only validate your arguments about American behavior. This was exactly what Ibrahim had hoped for, to force a division within American policy circles between those who wanted to respond with traditional intimidation tactics and those who recognized that such tactics would only prove his point about American imperial behavior. And what would the alternative approach look like? He asked. Genuine negotiation, real partnership agreements that benefit both sides equitably, transparency in resource extraction contracts, investment in African development rather than just African extraction? She paused. It would require admitting that current relationships need fundamental restructuring. Ibrahim studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. What he saw was someone genuinely conflicted between institutional loyalty and moral awakening, much like Colonel Mitchell had been during the afternoon's confrontation. Director Kellerman, I appreciate your candor, but you must understand that trust once broken is difficult to restore. African leaders have heard promises of partnership and mutual benefit for decades while watching their resources flow away and their people remain poor. I understand, Mr. President. That's why any new approach would need to be demonstrated through actions, not just words. They talked for another hour, with Kellerman outlining potential frameworks for genuinely equitable resource partnerships, while Ibrahim explained the historical context that made African nations skeptical of Western intentions. It was the kind of conversation that should have taken place years earlier. But American policymakers had preferred to deal with African leaders who didn't ask difficult questions. As Kellerman prepared to leave, she made one final statement that surprised Ibrahim. Mr. President, regardless of what happens next, you've performed a service for both our countries today. Americans need to understand the true cost of their prosperity, and Africans need to see that they don't have to accept exploitation as inevitable. After she left, Ibrahim stood once again at his window overlooking the glittering lights of New York City. The immediate confrontation was over, but the larger battle was just beginning. His phone continued to buzz with messages from African leaders, international journalists, and civil society organizations that had received copies of the day's documentation. The truth was out now, spreading across the world through social media, news reports, and diplomatic channels. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressures, and new opportunities. But tonight, for the first time in years, Ibrahim felt that the balance of power in the global conversation about Africa's future had shifted. The colonized had spoken to the colonizers as equals. The exploited had confronted the exploiters with evidence they could not deny, and the world had watched it happen in real time. As he prepared for bed, Ibrahim's final thought was of the children studying by candlelight in villages across Burkina Faso. Today's confrontation had been for them to ensure that future generations would not have to accept poverty as the price of other people's prosperity. The truth had indeed set them free. Now came the hard work of building a world where that freedom meant something concrete in the lives of ordinary people. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, truth had prevailed over power. And sometimes, that is enough to change everything. This story is dedicated to all leaders who choose truth over comfort, justice over profit, and the dignity of their people over the approval of their oppressors.